Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about building an amazing relationship between product management and product marketing. Great, so I'm Sean, I'll be today's moderator. I'm the product marketing manager here at Product Plan. And today I have with me Ronnie and Andre. So Ronnie Regev is a group product manager at AppFolio, where he leads product development teams in delivering innovative solutions to the property management industry and also coaches product managers there. Prior to AppFolio, he was a product manager at RightScale, and before that, he was senior manager of systems infrastructure at Ubisoft in Montreal.
Hi, Sean. Hi, Andre. Really happy to be here with you guys to talk about this super interesting topic.
Sweet. Thanks, Ryan. Also joining me is Andre Toyce. Andre is the director of marketing at Product Plan, and Andre has worked for disruptive technology companies for more than 10 years. Prior to Product Plan, he was a member of the marketing teams at RightScale, a B2B software company, Sonos, a consumer electronics company, and Citrix, another B2B software company. Andre received his master's in computer science from Cologne University in Germany.
Hey everybody, happy to be here. And Ronnie and I work together at RightScale, and we're excited to share some examples how Ronnie and I work together in the product management and marketing capacity.
Awesome, thanks Andre. So just a quick reminder, Ronnie and Andre will be addressing many of the questions that were submitted at registration. But if you have any additional questions throughout the webinar, feel free to chime in with the questions tool on GoToWebinar, and we'll answer them throughout on chat, and then also we'll answer as many as we can for the live Q&A at the end. So the reason we picked this webinar topic, and the reason I'm sure many of you are here today, is because we realize that alignment between product and marketing is crucial for success, both on a company level, an individual product level, and a feature level. If you build a fantastic product, but you don't market it successfully, there's a high likelihood that that product will fail. Likewise, you can have a killer marketing team, but if you don't build a product that addresses a market need and listens to customer feedback, that product is also likely to fail. And there are these inherent challenges in this relationship between product and marketing teams, and that's what we wanted to talk about today, how you can overcome those and how you can build those successful relationships. So as many of you probably know, the product manager and the product marketing manager, they often have very loosely defined job functions. And there's a high degree of fluidity in the roles and responsibilities between those two roles. Oftentimes, they report to different VPs, and very frequently they'll have very different success metrics. A product manager might have sort of product usage as a metric or kind of engagement with the product, whereas a marketing manager or a product marketing manager might have stuff like web traffic or leads generated, that sort of thing. So with these different VPs and with these different success metrics, it can mean very different priorities on the day-to-day, and this can introduce challenges between these two teams. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. First off, we'll dive into roles and responsibilities. We'll go through customer communication and how different product and marketing teams can work together. We'll touch on the product planning process. We'll dive into pricing and price testing. We'll look at product/feature launch, and then we'll close things out with a Q&A. And just a note, Andre and Ronnie, they'll have great insight, and they've both been at a variety of companies, but definitely take everything they say or everything that I say with a grain of salt. We'll be presenting sort of our experiences and our perspectives on these topics, but it's definitely not a blanket, this is how you should manage product and marketing relationships. Our sort of experience is skewed a little bit towards the B2B software space, but we'd love to hear sort of your thoughts and questions on this relationship in other industries or ways that you've done it at other companies. So feel free to chime in with questions about that. Great, so to kick things off, we'd love to get an idea of who our audience is today, who's joining us. So I'm going to publish a quick poll And if you could submit your response on whether you're coming from the product side, from the marketing side, or from any other department, we'd love to get an idea of who's joining us and who, how we can tailor some of our content for you today. Great, so it looks like, unsurprisingly, there's a large number of product managers and PMs here today, and then a pretty sizable contingent of marketing folks. So that's perfect. We'll dive into how you guys can work together and build this amazing relationship. So for our first topic, I'll pass things off to Andre, who's going to talk about roles and responsibilities.
Great, thanks so much, Sean. So the first topic is roles and responsibilities. And we've gotten a lot of questions from all of you. Thank you very much for submitting all those questions. I think we came close to 100 questions. We had a great time going through all of those. And the 5 different topics that we picked today is essentially a representation of all the questions. We, of course, couldn't answer all of those questions that were submitted, but we think the patterns that we identified is a good reflection of those. And really the #1 most asked question when you registered for this webinar was, tell me a bit about how you define what the functions are in product management and what the marketing department is working on. So really in this first section, we're tackling and sharing a bit of a glimpse how Ronnie and I work together at RightScale. And then Ronnie is sharing an example how he is dividing the functions between product and marketing at AppFolio today. And some of the questions that we're trying to answer here is, who is leading the market analysis, for example? Who defines the buyer persona? And who executes the win and loss analysis? I'm using the Pragmatic marketing framework in order to walk you through how Ronnie and I work together at RightScale. I hope most of you are familiar with the Pragmatic marketing framework. And I think Pragmatic is doing a wonderful job defining the different functions that mostly fall in product as well as in marketing. If you're not familiar with it, then I highly recommend to just check it out and download it. I think in particular for new product managers or people new in marketing, it's a good guidance how to go about some of the different functions. First, I want to reiterate what Sean says. I think the reality is that there is no one-size-fits-all. When I walk you through in a little bit how we divvied up things at RightScale, it was different when I worked at Sonos, a consumer electronics company, and it's yet a little different here at Product Plan, a software startup. So your own situation really depends on your skill sets, your team, your product, your market, et cetera, et cetera. But hopefully when I walk you through some of those examples here, there are some takeaways for everybody and some inspirational ideas how one can go about divvying up the task between product and marketing. So real quick, RightScale was a B2B software company. Keep that in mind. This is a few years ago, the example I'm sharing here. And at that point, you were roughly about 250 employees. The product team had 5 PMs. And I think we had roughly a product portfolio of 4 different products. One was the flagship, and then we were in the process of launching a new product. And we had myself, a product marketing manager at the time, as well as one other product marketing manager. And then the entire team and marketing roughly was about 15 people. So keep that in mind. And what I did here, when you look at the Pragmatic example, when you download this, again, I think most of you probably are familiar with it. All the squares are blue. What I did is I color-coded the squares based on what fell in the marketing lead or what fell in the product lead, as well as where we collaborated on. So everything that is orange or yellow here, that is what mainly was driven by product. All the red squares were highly collaborative. It wasn't necessarily that it was a 50-50 split, but I think both marketing and product were collaborating quite a bit on it. And then the green squares are the squares that were mainly, or the functions that were mainly led by marketing. And then there are some squares that were blue. The reason why I left them blue is because they weren't all that applicable to RightScale at the time. And as I like this example, the pragmatic marketing framework, not everything is necessarily applicable to your business, I would assume. And so the general gist is that in the beginning of the product inception, the ideation phase, you see a lot of orange or yellow, which means a lot of those functions usually and at RightScale fell in the lead of product management. And then later on, when you actually market and sell the product, not surprisingly, that's when marketing is leading the charge. But you can see that even across the board from early on, there are areas that are highly collaborative. And then even later on, I think it's not just you pass it on to sales and your job is done. I think it's a cycle, and both product and marketing need to continue to stay involved. But the general gist is that early on, usually things are being led by product management, and they were led by product management, and then later on, marketing becomes the lead of this. Let me pick a few examples here. I think I would take all the time of this webinar if I explained every single square of this. But so how we did things, and later on I will elaborate on this, is early on the PMMs and the PM were collaborating on analyzing our competitors, and this was highly collaborative. And I'm not too fond of the term distinctive competencies. I think I like personally differentiators better. That was usually driven by product management, and Ronnie and I worked together on a new product launch in this example, the RightScale self-service portal. So he was driving and figuring out what are the primary differentiators. And for this one example, the buy, build, or partner was very important, because at that point in time, we weren't exactly sure if we wanted to build this product ourselves or if we wanted to partner with a different vendor in the space. And this was also something that was primarily driven by Ronnie, if I remember correctly. And then once we had the prototype and once we were closer to market ready, we were figuring out the launch plan. This was another highly collaborative example. And then the one last example that I wanted to share with you is collateral. So once the product was pretty much ready for launch, then I led the charge on writing a white paper for the self-service portal that we put out on the marketing website. That was a lead generator for us. And I worked together with the PM on this, but I led the charge on this. So this hopefully gives you a little bit of the flavor of some of the functions that are involved and how we did things at RightScale. And then next, I would like Ronnie to share how things are split up at AppFolio today.
Well, thanks, Andre. It's nice to hear about some fond old memories of when we worked together at RightScale, doing cool stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about AppFolio now. And just to set a bit of context, so it's AppFolio Property Manager. We're a publicly traded B2B software as a service. We have about 500 employees that are part of the property manager part of our business. We have another division or line of business, if you will, that is a B2B SaaS for small law firms, but I'm not really involved in that, so we're not really going to touch on that. So at AppFolio, we're about 8 product managers right now in a team of approximately 30 people that roll up to the VP of product. So that includes user experience design, research, customer experience, some folks in analytics, and some other people who help facilitate product development. And on the marketing side, we have 3 communications and content specialists, which you can think of as the equivalent of product marketing manager. We don't have anybody with that specific title in our company, but they're essentially in the same role. Now, those 3 folks are in a much larger marketing organization, which is about 25 people, many of whom support both lines of business for AppFolio, so the property manager side, and in my case, which is our other line of business. We're just going to talk about the property manager side. So One thing to set a bit of context about the way our product development teams here work is that each team is really empowered to focus on any part of our product at any given time. Now, it makes that presents a unique set of challenges when it comes to roles and responsibilities, because you don't have a product manager or a team that has functional ownership over a particular part of our fairly broad product. But a lot of the same responsibilities are present in terms of messaging, in terms of market analysis, pricing, market sizing, validation, et cetera. Now, Andre's alluded to a sort of cyclical nature, and we'll touch on that a little bit later, but it's really important to bring in here that we have, as things move between the product development cycle, there are different inputs from different groups at different times. So talking about the specific responsibilities of the marketing team, prospect messaging is something that falls really squarely into their camp. So they're really responsible for defining what that message is that goes to our market in demand and lead generation. Customer messaging is a little more of a shared responsibility. So marketing is at the forefront of customer messaging in terms of defining nurturing campaigns, webinars, etc. However, the content itself, while being driven by marketing, is very much informed by our customer loyalty team, which works with our existing customers on how to drive adoption of their features, as well as avoiding churn, and the product management team. So in this case, the product management team, we contribute to customer messaging in the form of being subject matter experts. And we'll talk a lot more about that later on when we touch on product and feature launches. So go-to-market planning. The next area of marketing messaging that's very interesting is in-app messaging. So as a B2B SaaS product, we have a fairly large customer base, and we're delivering new features and customer value on a weekly basis. Now, how do you get customers to be aware of those new features and services? Traditional marketing channels aren't always the best approach, or you may want to try different approaches. And we'll dig into that specific example a little bit later on. Now, as far as the product management team's responsibilities, it's fairly broad. The product team is responsible for things like market analysis, total addressable market sizing, driving pricing, and Andre is going to touch on pricing a little bit later on, win-loss analysis. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that these are not solo efforts. Product managers or product management team don't go and hide out in a meeting room or in a cave or something and emerge with new pricing or market sizing. It's very much a collaborative effort. Now, go-to-market planning is something that varies on a per product basis or per feature basis, but again, it's also very collaborative, and it's very much dependent on inputs from marketing, from sales, from services, customer success, etc. And we'll dig into that a little bit later on. So back to you, Andre.
Thanks, Ronnie. So those are a couple of examples to hopefully give you two different flavors how you can think about it. And I wanted to share another framework with you guys. I don't have time to really drill in here, but the two frameworks I personally really like is the Pragmatic one. That's why I used it earlier. And the other one is Roman's product management framework, romanpichler.com. So if you want to go there and download it. And the framework is really the one on the left side here. And the other one, he has a few different flavors of this, and that's why I like it. I think in particular for people who are new to product management, this might be helpful. So the one example I put in here, and he has more, is the technical product manager. And Roman does a good job, in my opinion, to outline some of the core competencies. So if you're in need for some other inspiration, romanpichler.com, pichler.com is another good framework. So a few takeaways in regards to roles and responsibilities. Number one, frameworks can only give you guidance. And as you saw, you need to mold it to your own processes. And depending on what market you're in, what product you're in, this might be a completely different picture for you. But if you have no idea at all, I highly suggest go there and figure out what can be done and how do you want to divvy up things. The next one is really focused on strengths rather than shortcomings, and free yourself a little bit. Historically or traditionally, this is being owned by product versus marketing. Whoever has a good skill set and gets the job done, that's perfect. It really doesn't matter who does what, as long as the job gets done. Because at the end of the day, both marketing and product are working towards the same goal. And then last but not least, roles, in my opinion, don't have to be set in stone. I'm a big believer in if something doesn't work, change it. So I want to leave you in regards to roles and responsibilities with those 5 different takeaways.
Great, thanks, Andre. So we're going to dive into our next section now, but before we do so, we're going to do another poll to get you engaged again. So we'd love to hear, what are your biggest customer communication challenges, either on the product side, the marketing side? So let me launch this poll for us really quick. So if you could submit your answers now, choosing in-product messaging, website positioning, sales enablement, new feature announcements, or other, just to give us a good idea of where we see the biggest challenges. Awesome, thanks everybody. So it looks like new feature announcements and sales enablement are really a couple of the biggest challenges, and that's great. I think Ronnie especially is going to dive into how you handle some of those new feature announcements and in-app messaging, etc. And I think sales enablement will definitely touch on that in the Q&A. So thanks very much, and I will pass it off to Andre for our next to Ronnie for our next topic, customer communication.
Thanks, Sean. And I took note of sales enablement as one of the areas that everyone's most interested in learning more about, and I'll make sure to circle back to that when we dive into product launches. But for now, let's talk about customer communication and the challenges there. So high quality customer communication is essential to product launches and to feature adoption. One of the first slides that Sean showed is Google Glass, which is a perfect example of really interesting technology without very much the foresight into how to message the value of that particular product. So some of the challenges that we've experienced and that you've asked about are who writes positioning statements? So who creates the content, positioning statements, and value propositions that actually make sense to buyers and users? Who's driving in-app messaging? So that also, when, how often, to what ends, and part of that also includes feature announcements. And how to effectively work together on both of these points, and more generally, how to collaborate on marketing programs. So I'm going to dive into an example at AppFolio, something that I experienced over the last couple of years. We skip to the next slide. Perfect. All right, so a little bit of context here. So AppFolio launched a maintenance contact center service 2 years ago or so that allows property managers to offload service request calls to an AppFolio call center. So a really simple example is there's a power failure in your apartment in the middle of the night, and you call your landlord or your property manager to figure out what's going on. They may ask you a few questions. Maybe it's a circuit breaker problem, or maybe there's a larger power outage, whatever it may be. Perhaps they decide to dispatch a vendor to come and fix the problem. So we launched this service about 2+ years ago, and the adoption was going fairly well. Now, about a year into the service launch, I would regularly hear from customers who were still struggling with after-hours maintenance calls, and it was quite difficult for them. They would have to wake up in the middle of the night. They would, they couldn't go on vacation, et cetera. So quite disruptive. And when I would mention that we had this service, they would be ecstatic, right? They didn't realize that we could actually do this for them. So the takeaway there was that many of our customers weren't aware of this highly valuable service that could actually affect not only their business, but also how they live their lives. So with marketing and the business line owners and product, we sat down and we thought, well, what can we do differently? How can we get the word out to our customers that there is a solution to their problem? So our first approach at this, which is the sort of bullet point number one here, was our marketing and the line of business owners were pushing to find ways to promote the service, the service in-app. Now, product management, design, and development, we were a little reluctant to transform what is a business tool into a place where you would see ads for a service. So we started slowly, and we had this first option here, which is on the main page of our product, and it was very selective which users actually saw this message. Now, the call to action, click here to learn more, that actually linked users out to a marketing hosted landing page, which described the value propositions, feature function, benefits, costs, etc. And it gave customers a way to express interest. I want to sign up for the service, contact me. We tried that, and we realized really quickly that it was a good approach, but it wasn't really getting the reach we wanted. Now, working with marketing on getting the content right on that landing page was essential, because in product development, engineering, and product management, we're not necessarily experts in copywriting. We don't know what the best approaches are. And it was a lot faster for our marketing team, who build landing pages regularly, to use their set of tools to bring that really quickly, and have product development focus on how do we actually build this banner in-app. We then switched to putting something that's a little more discoverable, which is in the navigation of our product. And so that was example number two. So this contact center section of our product. And if you weren't signed up for the service, that's what customers would see. They'd see that there's a way to extend the service, and click here to learn more. Now that click here to learn more, the call to action linked again out to that marketing landing page. That drove more traffic. And what we realized from there was that we were getting attention on this landing page, but we weren't seeing the conversion rates that we were really hoping for. And kind of taking a step back here, one of the things that was really important was defining some of the goals. Like, what were we expecting to get? What would success look like in terms of traffic to this landing page, and ultimately leads generated, so that our account managers could go and get customers enabled for this service? So having some insight into traffic gave everybody in product development the confidence to know that we're onto something, but we need to iterate on it. We need to push a little bit more. So if we go over to the next slide, this is where we ended up at. So we took that entire marketing landing page and moved it into our product. So there are two parts of the content. The left is the top of the page, the right is the bottom of the page. So we worked really closely with marketing to make sure that the messaging was spot on. How it worked made a lot of sense. The fact that there was a call to action at the top of the page was something that was really heavily informed by marketing. They said, well, if the purpose of this page is to drive conversions, we need to put a call to action at the top of the page so people can take action on that right away. Provide social proof. That's not something that we necessarily thought of initially. Provide a video. So marketing had put together this video, which actually came from our Marcom site initially, and then we embedded it into our application. So what was important for marketing and for our line of business owners was that we were trying to expand the reach. And what was important for product development, and also for other parts of the company, was that there's an emphasis on this content being presented to customers in a way that made sense, but also was unobtrusive. Right? This is a business tool after all. Our customers are paying us to use this product to operate their businesses, and not necessarily to be marketed to. But it was a great opportunity for marketing to inform product development on how to message customers in a way that made a lot of sense, highlighting value, providing social proof, etc. And this one page actually is now the top lead generation source for this service, which has had a huge impact on our business, and more importantly, is a huge impact on our customers and their ability to operate operate their business more efficiently and effectively. So now going to some customer communication takeaways. Having alignment on goals upfront was critical to bypass any disagreements and to keep everybody essentially working in the same direction, right? If there's ever any tension, sort of unhealthy tension, because the last point is healthy tension, we could always come back to what goals are we trying to accomplish here? What are we trying to deliver to our customers? And what are we trying to deliver to our business? And keeping an open mind to new approaches is essential. So working cross-functionally means being exposed to different ideas and valuable perspectives that can elevate your thinking, can give you a different perspective on how to solve important problems for your customers. And this is something that I encourage everybody to embrace. Leveraging each other's expertise is essential. And part of that is being patient and educating each other on how does marketing work? How does product management work? How does user experience research work? How does design work? And giving each other enough perspective so that we know how to really leverage each other's expertise and know where to fill in it for each other. Now, working in a high-paced agile delivery environment can be really challenging for teams that aren't in product development. We have teams at AppFolio that work with a one-story work in progress limit and no backlog. They're defining what to do every morning. Having external dependencies can be really challenging, but again, going back to keeping an open mind and aligning on goals is really important and helpful there. And sharing information as frequently is essential to being able to have that agile environment work well with other departments. This is something that Andre is going to touch on a little bit later on. And the last one is that healthy tension is good. Now, that healthy tension is in terms, what I mean there is specifically in terms of messaging, right? So there's an importance to keep balance between technically grounded information and not too much sort of how to speak. So sometimes product managers tend to lead more towards sharing the glorious feature level details, and marketing can be a little bit lighter sometimes, and there's a tension there between figuring out the best possible message that's going to resonate with your customers. So that's it for customer communication. I'll give it back to you, Sean.
Awesome. Thanks, Ronnie. Super cool. I love that example, and I love seeing that in detail. So before we hop into our next topic, which is the product planning process, I'm going to do another poll, and we'd love to get your response on who's primarily responsible for your product planning process. So I know that this really varies from company to company, and I know it kind of varies for how your team is split up. But if you have somebody who's chiefly responsible, we'd love to kind of get an understanding of whether that's top down, bottom up, etc. And then again, just a reminder, if you have any questions about what Andre has talked about, or about what Ronnie has talked about, or just questions in general about this topic, please chime in, and we'll definitely get to those in the Q&A at the end. Great, so a pretty overwhelming majority on the product management side for product planning, which is good and I think encouraging for this topic. And then executives, not surprisingly, coming in at number 2 for sort of setting the strategy, possibly side of that product planning process. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Brian, or to you, Andre.
Thanks, Sean. Now here's the marketer presenting on product planning. You guys just told us that 70% almost is being led by product management. So the reminder, make sure to loop experts in early. So anyways, this topic is near and dear to my heart, because obviously we here at Product Client talk to product managers about this subject quite often. And the challenge here for product planning, how do you divvy things up between product management and marketing, when to loop in what particular groups of the company, just not only marketing, but beyond marketing, and how to prioritize roadmap, et cetera, et cetera. I will try to touch base on a few different things here, and I'm going to walk you through an example. In the interest of time, I will try to keep this quick, and we don't have enough time this 1 hour to really drill in super deep in any of those topics. So, but I hope there are some takeaways. So the example here I'm sharing, I mentioned that earlier, I'm using the Pragmatic example again, and I've removed some of the colored items. So everything blue is I'm not touching base on. Everything that's colored here, either red, orange, or green, I'm slightly touching base on. And the example that I'm sharing here is how Ronnie and I worked at RightScale at some of the major yearly themes. So at the end of the year, usually product marketing and product management got together, and they were doing a bunch of research on some of the major themes for the year. And we kind of paired up, really, and Ronnie and I paired up on self-service, and then we came up with some of our assumptions, some of analysis, and essentially doing the left side, the market problems, the differentiators, competitive landscape, et cetera, and then, like I said earlier, this not necessarily fits exactly to every company or every product. So then we jumped ahead to stakeholder communication, really, and we presented our findings with the executive team, and we're getting feedback, and then we're doing some iterations, and then ultimately items found itself on the product roadmap. And like I said earlier, there were some decisions that we needed executive feedback. Hey, is this something that we as a company are investing in and building out ourselves, or is this something that we want to partner up with, et cetera, et cetera. And then once we ultimately did some of the planning, the early research and planning, then this was again a collaborative effort, and we talked about the launch plan and figured out what items we needed during the launch plan. And this was both led by product as well as marketing, and then ultimately kicked off the product. So this is just a quick example how we did some of the yearly planning. What I wanted to share with you are a couple of recommendations here that I've also heard when talking to product managers while working here at Product Plan. So one recommendation is I would highly recommend, and it's great to see that we have a lot of product managers on this webinar, and that the majority things, or it is led by product management during the product planning. My recommendation to you is collect ideas across teams, not just the product management teams, but figure out who are your other stakeholders early on and prioritize together. And the reason for that is it's much easier to get buy-in, and it's much easier to be proactive about items if you loop folks in that you at some point need the help on early on. So we have something in product plan that we call the parking lot. It's a great way to collect ideas. And then we have another function in product plan that we call the planning board. It's a way for you to prioritize the different items. So those are a couple of things that you can use during that point in time, or just collect ideas otherwise. But the takeaway here is to make that collaborative and loop people in early. Another example I wanted to share with you, this is one of our customers, a company called Namely, and this is product plan on a big LCD screen here. And he is doing weekly meetings where the roadmap is on there. And I think the roadmap, frankly, is always on that screen. And people can check it out, and people can see what's on the roadmap. And during the meetings, he's augmenting the offline conversation around product planning, and it's updating the roadmap live. The point I'm making here is be transparent about it. At RightScale, we were using Atlassian Confluence, and we were embedding the roadmap into Atlassian Confluence, and everybody across the organization knew that's where it can go. And our roadmap was a live roadmap and was always up to date, and it wasn't a guessing game, and people always knew where the roadmap is. So be transparent about your roadmap. That's my recommendation. To summarize this topic, I already talked about transparency. And again, I would highly recommend if it is a tool like Product Plan, where you have a URL you can point people to where the live roadmap is, or if it is something else. But I would highly recommend to have a central location that's known across the organization, so people always are aware what we are working on, what the engineering team, for example, in a software company is working on, and it's not a guessing game. And then the other one, this is important to me too, because I've been in a situation, if you remember the Pragmatic framework, oftentimes sales and marketing is later on in the process, and it's important for folks in marketing to be proactive, and different people run at different paces. So whatever your pace is and product management may or may not mesh with marketing or other folks. So in order to avoid tension or bad tension and issues, I would recommend to loop people in early, because that allows everybody to get all the ducks in a row and come to the best possible outcome.
Sweet. Thanks, Andre. So before we dive into the next section, I'm going to hop in for our penultimate poll. The next topic is around pricing. And so we're just kind of curious about how often do you test your pricing model or price point? I know this is another one that I expect will vary significantly based on the type of business. I know we've had a lot of discussions around this here at Product Plan, so we'd love to sort of get your feedback here. And thank you for the questions. Continue to ask those and chime in if you have anything we'd like to cover, you'd like us to cover here at the end. Great. So interesting here, a majority of the responses being in the other category. If you did vote other and you'd like to chime in on the questions with what that time frame is, if it's very, very frequent, or if it's significantly longer than every 5 years, we'd love to sort of get a taste of that. But for now, I'll pass it back to Andre to talk through pricing.
Thanks, Sean. It was very interesting that this was a fairly even split, and I've done quite a bit of research on that, and I feel like there was no definitive answer. Do you mind closing the poll? Perfect. And so it seems like different people approach this topic quite different. So what I wanted to tackle here in this section is share a quick example how, in my opinion, can effectively navigate a pricing update. And in my opinion, a pricing update is something that should be done, because I believe that, especially for a startup, you probably didn't get it right the first time around. And most of the companies I've been part of in my career so far shy oftentimes away from pricing updates. And I think you don't need to do that. And my recommendation, my first recommendation here is to test pricing and be experimental. And if in particular for an early startup, because you probably didn't get it right the first time around. The next one is important to me too, and I've been on both sides of the equation, is more often than not, I see a simple, easy to understand pricing plan always succeed more often than a complicated one. Now, as that sounds obvious, perhaps, I've been part of companies where we had very complicated pricing plans. And sometimes the reason is you involve a lot of different folks from different parts of the organization that chime in, and there's operational components, and then there's executive team that just sees dollar signs. If they create this really hard to understand tiered system with cryptic terminology, et cetera, et cetera. So oftentimes it can be tempting to develop a model that you believe brings you a lot of revenue, but I would urge you, if you can, keep things simple, because the reality is, if your own sales force isn't understanding the pricing model, guess what? Your customers are most likely not understanding as well, and that's an issue. And another one is, I've been on this equation as well, is if you do a price increase, for example, I'm a big believer, if you're a startup, that you have to reward your early adopters. They're making a leap of faith if they sign up early, and they are a big reason, if things are going well, that your company has traction. And in return, I believe it's ethical to actually reward them with that early price point that is cheaper if it's a pricing increase, and reward them for the leap of faith. And the other side is, if you do not, this may backfires, and your early adopters, you see them disappearing, and they're going to leave you because they feel like they weren't treated well. So a few takeaways in regards to pricing, and I think we could make pricing its own topic and webinar series. I apologize for racing through this. Award your early adopters, super important and the right thing to do in my opinion. If you can, keep it simple. I'm a big fan of how Tesla is selling their automobiles in an industry where negotiation and different price points and discounts is a very common thing. Tesla has one price point and every customer pays the same price, and I think that's working out well for them. And then really don't be afraid to update your model and test pricing. I think that's totally fine, and it takes a few iterations in order to figure out really what's the best pricing model for your product. And last but not least, in particular in B2B, I think it's probably unlikely for most of you guys out there that you compete on price. I think there's so many other factors that are important to a buyer. That does it fit into my process? Is everybody else buying it, et cetera, et cetera. That price point is just one of many components, even though that I'm sure we hear it every now and then. I've heard it at all the different companies I've worked at, that people are quick to scream, it's too expensive. But the reality is that there is many other cost factors that weighing in way more than the actual price point.
Awesome, thanks, Andre. So really quick, everyone, we're gonna do our final poll related to the product and feature idea go-to-market launch. So if you could submit your answers there on how long is your process from product or feature idea to market launch. And I realize that this will, like many of the other questions, vary significantly from company to company, but we'd like to get an idea of just that ideation to first launch and what that process looks like across organizations. Great, thanks for chiming in. And it looks like it's sort of the majority or almost the majority there in the 1 to 6 month time frame. So interesting. I think Ronnie will be able to touch on that when he talks about his product feature launch cycle and dive a little bit deeper. But I'll pass it over to you now, Ronnie.
All right, thanks, Sean. Wish we could talk about pricing for hours and hours. It's such a super interesting topic. But let's talk about product and feature launch, which is also a really interesting topic, since that is, in many cases, the culmination of product development efforts in most environments. So some of the questions we'll dive into is, what does, whoops, there we go, sorry, notes got messed up. What does marketing drive and what does product management drive during the lead up to a product launch, and also afterwards? Who takes on certain responsibilities like deciding on press releases or talking to analysts? And going back to one of the poll results earlier is, how do you create sales messaging and collateral? So I'm going to dive into what we typically do at AppFolio. And that really short time cycle, the poll is like 1 to 6 months typically between sort of like ideation and launch. That's really similar to what we experience or what we're doing at AppFolio. So there are two main components for us in creating go-to-market planning or in feature launches. So the first one is what we call a key messaging doc. So it's a lightweight collaborative document that's written very much in partnership or paired up with the product manager, and in our case, the communications and content specialist, or the product marketing manager, if you will. Now, this document, it contains feature details, customer messaging, value proposition statements or value proposition ideas, competitive analysis, how we think we could position this feature or service in our market, what's supported. So going to sales enablement, we really try to touch on supported and very much so unsupported use cases. So we try to call out there, what should we sell and what shouldn't we sell? So that very much informs prospect messaging and what the talk tracks could be in the sales conversation. We try to empower our sales reps and SDRs to talk about the problems that our software solves and not speculate on what could be solved. Now, this key messaging doc is typically used for sort of larger features or new services, rarely for iterations on existing features or products, though. Now, who writes how much? It really depends on the product that's being launched. It depends on the scope of it. This is the source of information for what will be pushed into press releases, for example, into our marketing communication site, any in-app messaging, sales collateral, etc. Now, the other thing that's really the other components to our feature launches or go-to-market planning that's really important is what we call core teams. It's pretty common practice, but it's a cross-functional core team that is typically driven by the product manager. So they're the ones calling the meetings, taking the notes, sending out action items, etc. Now, this core team meets regularly, really early on, and it consists of folks from product, engineering, design, services, support, implementation, sales, and also, and most importantly, marketing. Now, what is being discussed there is, it's actually more like a bi-directional input for, and transparency for, what are the development decisions that are being made? What are the design decisions that are being made? What use cases are we deciding to solve for and not? How do things actually work? Providing insight into any learnings, quantitative and qualitative, that we're accumulating along the way if we're doing sort of a soft or beta launches, and really hashing out what that go-to-market plan is. Now, it's in these meetings, for example, that, or these groups, for example, that the decision to create a press release or to, and we don't often work with analysts, but that type of decision would emerge from this type of group. And the marketer in the group, or the product marketer, will have all the information that they need and the inputs they need to go and make that decision, then circle that back into the group. Now, the one thing that I wanted to touch on, if we go to the next slide, Sean, is that I was looking for a way to describe the cyclical nature of product launches. So, because product development is inherently an iterative process. Now, I'm sure almost everyone here is 60–70% product managers, so you're probably all familiar with Steve Blank's build, measure, learn cycle. Now, one thing that I don't often hear discussed is, where does marketing fit into that? But for me, my view on it is that there's an obvious input, and that is the measure part, right? Measuring how customers and the market responds is an essential input that informs learning and continues this virtuous cycle. Now, responsibilities and roles and who's playing what shifts over time, but these are understanding how your customers and your market are responding to what is being built or what's being delivered is essential to understanding if you continue down that path or if you need to shift. And that goes into ideation, which then feeds into figuring out what to build and deliver next. Back into that in-app marketing example that I mentioned earlier, it was quicker and cheaper to leverage the tools, Marketo in this case, that our marketing team had, and they were able to produce this landing page in no time, relatively speaking. Now, that provided meaningful quantitative inputs into what we decide into what we had to do next. So those were the key learnings, and that informed what we built. Those insights were essential to figuring out what we had to do next, and really pushed us to pivot into bringing that content in-app. So without marketing's input, we would have potentially made a bunch of assumptions and used that to drive decision making, which is not a really good approach in product development. So if we go to the takeaways here, so product feature launch takeaways, it's an iterative process, and it's really important to keep an open mind about how to continue to deliver value to your customers, and how do you continue to feed information back into each other into this cycle. Now, roles, responsibilities, and levels of contribution shift over time. It's okay if the product manager maybe writes the initial help document, or it's okay if the product marketing manager has more insight or is a bit more of a subject matter expertise and can provide that input. It's all okay if you're aligned ultimately on the same user outcomes. Meeting early and often is really essential. So especially in a fast-paced agile delivery environment, having inputs and sharing information often is essential, and that goes to the last point about maintaining transparency with each other. So what is product development thinking? What is design thinking? What is research thinking? What is marketing thinking? And making sure to share that information with each other early, often, and regularly, so that you're able to ensure that your product launch is as successful as possible. You're delivering as much value to your customers to impact your business goals as best as possible. So those are some of the key takeaways. And so in summary, kind of wrapping this up, there are three main takeaways that, channeling what Andre shared, that we would like you to kind of go away with. One, the first one is that product managers and product marketing managers need to wear different hats. It's the nature of our job. Whenever I start up with a new product development team, the first question I ask is, what do you need from me? How can I help you? How can I help us achieve the goals that we want? And that shifts all the time. It's the same thing with product marketing. Roles change. Now, understanding that you're working to the same company goals, the same user outcomes is essential. If you keep your user outcomes in front of every decision that you're making, it makes a lot of debates and dilemmas easier to overcome. And the last takeaway is be experimental. Keep that experiment-driven mindset in place. If something doesn't work, that's okay. Change it. Like I was saying before, maybe today marketing writes content, and maybe tomorrow you're analyzing user engagement, or maybe product management is involved in creating content today and it's being improved on by marketing at a later time. That's totally okay. Those are the three takeaways. We want to make sure that we leave enough time for Q&A. So I'm going to pass it back to Sean and we'll dig into some questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Ronnie. We'll dive straight into the questions just because I know we went a little bit long. So if you have any more, submit them. We'll try and get to them. If not, we'll answer them after the webinar. We'll shoot you a note if it's something specific. So first up, one of the questions, what team, marketing versus product, should be responsible for gathering consumer/customer insight? Andre, do you want to maybe speak to this really quick?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I was alluding to earlier, I don't think any roles have to be set in stone, and I think all of us in product as well as in marketing and other organizations need to be flexible enough in order to wear different hats, as Ronnie just shared in some of the takeaways. I think personally it's important for every group within an organization to talk to customers as often as possible, especially for product as well as marketing. And if nobody is currently taking ownership, it doesn't matter if you're a PM or a PMM, take the lead and fill the gap and charge ahead. So I think really the lesson here is divide and conquer, and wear that hat that is not yet taken. That said, in my past, I've seen more often than not that this is driven primarily by product more so than marketing.
Cool. Thanks, Andre. Ronnie, here's one for you. How do Scrum teams delivering code weekly properly engage product marketing managers, especially when they're a shared resource?
That's a great question. Yes. Am I perfect? I'm not muted. Yeah, so that's a great question, and it is literally what I live every single day at my work at AppFolio, because weekly delivery is our cadence. So it's the responsibility of the product manager and the product team to provide short, be it on a daily or even a weekly cadence, and midterm insight into what's happening. Product manager should have enough insight into knowing what problems are going to be solved. Now, you may not have the exact feature function details ironed out. Maybe those stories aren't groomed. Maybe it's not. Maybe the features aren't built. But you should have a good idea as to what problems you're going to solve, and provide enough insight into enough insights to product marketing to figure out how to message things correctly, how to ramp up for that. In our company or at AppFolio, our director, director of product management, is responsible for socializing a rolling 2-month product roadmap every 2 weeks. So we have this anecdote, or we used to have 2-week sprints. We now have 1-week sprints essentially, but we stick to this 2-week cadence. And it's our director's responsibility to go and do effectively a roadmap roadshow every 2 weeks and give insight to the entire organization around what's happening in these two weeks, next 2 weeks, 1 month, and 2 months out. So a lot of the responsibility falls on product management to make sure that you're communicating effectively outwards to the rest of the organization and giving people the insight that they need so that they can do their part as it relates to product development and delivery.
Awesome, thanks, Ronnie. Diving into the next question for Andre, this one regarding pricing. Can you give a product manager and a product marketing manager some tips on how to encourage VP and executive levels to engage in price testing?
That's very good. Good question. And it can be challenging, no question about it. And my recommendation here is data. Do your homework first, and don't just go in there and say, hey, we haven't updated pricing in a while, let's update it. I think that's a weak argument. And be prepared and figure out what is your ask and what exactly do you have in mind. Come with not just one proposal, but maybe 3 different flavors. And okay, Mr. VP, Mr. Executive, here are 3 different proposals that I have in mind. What I even sometimes do is create a mock-up. This is how it looks like if we change the pricing on our pricing page. I think once an executive or VP sees that, they can identify with them, and they can they're more likely to agree. If you bring data, if you bring your projections, your analysis, and if you make it as real as possible, I think they're more likely to engage with you. They're more likely to be open with price testing. And then in regards to testing, honestly, I still somewhat struggle figuring out if there's a good tool for that does, let's say, an A/B test. But I wouldn't be too hung up, if I were you, on figuring out, well, do I want an A/B test and whatnot? If you have a strong reason to do a test, then just put it out there at a minimum, time box it, and let the test run for 1 or 2 months. And then just look if there's any major drastic shift in direction, and do a conclusion. That would be my recommendation for you.
Great, thanks, Andre. I think we have time for one more question. Ronnie, this one will go to you. What are the roles and responsibilities of technical product managers versus business product managers? And do you have that distinction at AppFolio?
So that's a great question. No, we don't have that distinction. The product management role at AppFolio is very much customer facing, although in that our responsibilities as it relates to product development is to identify and to curate the problems to be solved, and a little less on how you were going to go about solving that problem. Right? The solutioning, if you will, or the how we're going to solve a particular problem or address an opportunity, if you want to look at it sort of like glass half full, it's shared, but it's primarily driven by some of the most creative people we have in the building, who are software engineers and designers. So that's where sort of product management sits at AppFolio, is find the problems to solve, advocate for why they're important for our business, for why they're, ultimately important for our customers. That's above everything else. And then empower engineering, empower design to solve those problems, facilitate the flow of information. I think in certain environments, for example, like where Andre and I worked previously at RightScale, essentially we were technical product managers, because the product that we built was in its nature extremely technical, right? Is an abstraction layer on top of multiple infrastructure as a service providers, UI and API. So it's like that in its nature is very technical. So you had to be a technical product manager to understand how to actually build out a new version of an API. It's not a simple thing. So I think the roles shift very much dependent on the company. We don't have a product owner role, for example, at AppFolio. A lot of those responsibilities are kind of owned collectively by the engineering team or by the engineering lead or director that's on a team.
Awesome, cool. Thanks for giving that example, and appreciate it. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us. We loved your questions, we loved your feedback, and if you have any further questions for Andre or for Ronnie, you can hit them up on Twitter. There's their Twitter handles there, and likewise, if you have any questions about what we're doing at Product Plan, feel free to visit our website, give us some feedback on our pricing. So thanks again everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.